Thank you, worship team. It's hot. I'm sorry, in case you got here late, the air conditioning is not working. So when you're sitting there, just think to yourself, hell is hotter. All right? And be glad I only have like an hour sermon today. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, if you feel the need to get up, I think the back part of the building is actually still, the AC is still working. We've got water. If you need to fan yourself, whatever you need to do, feel free to do it. I will not be offended. And I know it's hot, so I'll try to honor that. So we're in this 3-week series on traction, spiritual traction. The idea is that like when, if your car is stuck on ice and your wheels are spinning, very often it needs very little to just grip the road. Sometimes something as simple as sand or kitty litter is all that you need to put beneath your wheels to get you going. And in the same way, very often in life, especially spiritually, we find ourselves with our wheels spinning. And what I'm trying to help us see is that little things go a long way to giving us traction. We're talking about this idea of spiritual traction, and in trying to make my point, I'm trying to get you to see that you should never underestimate what happens to a life when love and faith come in. But love and faith are very often the result of very small exchanges, not massive ones. And so very often we find spiritual traction in the places we would never think to look. And in John chapter 4, there's an interchange between Jesus and a Samaritan woman. In this little interchange, this nowhere place where no one else is around, we see a woman come in one way and leave another because she gained spiritual traction in her interchange with Jesus. And we're going to, over these last week, this week, and next week, we're just going to be camped in John chapter 4, looking at how spiritual traction takes place. Last week, we talked about what kind of mindset Jesus brought into the exchange with this woman and how he embraced where he was and he saw more than labels. He did not just see a Samaritan woman, he saw a person. This week, we're going to look at this thing that Jesus does that we all should be involved in, and it's called a spiritual conversation. Jesus engages this woman in a spiritual conversation. Now, she'll, as we read in a second, she'll try to make it practical, she'll try to make it cultural, she'll try to make it religious, and Jesus continues to drive it to the spiritual. Well, what makes something a spiritual conversation? And I would argue that a spiritual conversation is one in which, when you're done, your image of Jesus is different. A spiritual conversation is something that takes place that after you're done, when you leave, when you're finished, your image of Jesus is different. There's probably no more powerful way to have your ideas about Jesus changed than through spiritual conversation. If you honestly think about the things that shape and impact and really bring transformation, I bet if you looked at your life story, you would see that very often it included a spiritual conversation. A dialogue with someone else that shaped and changed the way you thought about Jesus. Now, there are many other things that probably go into all that. They're all good things, but simple conversations are powerful things, and very often they have the greatest capacity to change your mind. And so one of the things that you need to think about, even as we're going through this, is how many spiritual conversations do you engage in? Do you let yourself talk to other people? Are you talking to other people about Jesus? And are those conversations changing the way you think? Jesus engages in this conversation with this woman, and this is the part we're going to look at in John chapter 4, verses 10 to 15. And I'm going to read it. Are we? Okay, we got it. Okay, great. I saw that So this is Jesus in John chapter 4, 10 to 15. Remember, we talked about last week, Jesus is stopped by a well in the middle of the day, and this Samaritan woman comes alone to the well to meet Jesus, and they engaged in a discussion. They began to engage in a discussion, and Jesus asked her to bring him some water. And she sort of said, "Why are you doing that?" And then now here we are in verse 10. It says, Jesus answered her, and he said, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" It's kind of ironic that I'm speaking on water in a non-air conditioned assembly, right? You're probably all like, Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty." So there's three things that I want us to look at in this interchange with Jesus and this spiritual conversation. Number one is the offer Jesus gives. Number two is the challenge he has. And number three, why he can do it. The very first thing I want you to think about in the midst of this passage is Jesus' offer. Jesus offers living water to this woman. Water is a deep, rich, powerful biblical metaphor, and probably the most obvious reason it's so powerful is because most of the Bible was written in a desert context. And so whenever you're in the desert, one of the most significant things that you need to find is water. And so this idea of water and a well sort of permeates this whole thing, and this image of living water can be traced throughout the Scriptures. But it's very interesting. There's two different words that they use for well in this passage. The Samaritan woman, when she begins to engage Jesus about dipping into the water, she uses the word well that just basically means a hole in the ground. Jesus, when he begins to talk about the well and the water, the word that he uses is a gusher. She pictures a hole in the ground. Jesus pictures an aquifer that is gushing up. So right away you pick up on two different images, and Jesus' image is of water just gushing up from the ground. Nothing stops it. It's not limited. Imagine if you're walking in a desert and you find a place where the water is literally gushing out. You would stop when you came to that. You would camp out there. You would build your life around it. You would depend on this gushing source to energize you. And this is what Jesus is offering to her. He's saying to her, "I am not simply a hole in the ground, a practical answer to your physical problem of thirst. I am a life-giving source that I am asking you to build your life around." He is engaging her in a spiritual conversation in which he wants to change the way she thinks about him. How about you? Do you think of Jesus as living water? In order to I think of him that way, you have to get your head around one basic truth, and that is this, that you are thirsty. You are thirsty. It's funny how, of course, today we're all painfully aware that we're thirsty. I got a drink right now, but very often we do not think about our thirst. I remember talking to Joe Ehrman, a friend of many of you here, and he was talking about one day we was playing in an NFL football game, and it was a particularly hot day. And after the game was over, the team had lost, and he couldn't stop crying. And he finally went to the trainer and he said, I don't know what's going on. I can't stop crying, and I don't care that we lost. It's not about the game. And the guy said, "You're dehydrated. You're dehydrated. You're not even aware. It's your dehydration that is causing your tears." We're thirsty. And very often our thirst manifests itself in ways that we don't recognize. And in the same way, our spiritual thirst manifests itself in ways that you don't think about. So let me just ask you some questions. When you think about spiritual thirst, maybe think of it this way. Your spiritual thirst can be kind of bubbled up by questions like this. Do you ever find yourself wrestling with what's going to happen to me? Are you ever wondering, like, how can I prepare myself to keep bad things from occurring? Do you find yourself often wrestling with how can I impress the important people in my life? Do you ask the question, who is there for me? Do you feel stuck and wonder how you can move forward? Do you ever wonder what you're going to be able to do with your anger, with your shame, with your fear? Do you ask yourself often, is there more to life than this? Those are spiritually thirsty questions. And Jesus wants us to understand that He alone can answer them. When He makes this claim that I am in fact living water, He is claiming that I am the answer to your spiritual thirsts. That's His offer. It's His offer to the Samaritan woman, and it's His offer to us. And if we're going to really engage in spiritual dialogue, we have to ask ourselves, do we really believe this? Now, it's interesting, her initial response, and probably for most of us, our initial response is a practical one. She says, well, if you're so great, if you're this source of living water, like you don't even have a little bucket. Like, how are you going to get this living water? She's saying, okay, I hear your offer. I practically don't know how you're going to pull this off. And it's very interesting, this is just a little side note, but she's the only other person that was able to make water appear from nothing in the history of Israel was Moses, when he struck the rock. And it provided water for the people in the desert for 40 years. And she's kind of like keying into what he's saying. And she's like, wait a minute, are you claiming to be somebody like Moses, so in touch with God that you're able to provide water out of nothing? You don't even have a bucket. So she gets very practical, and I think we do too. We say, okay, Mike, you're telling me Jesus is living water for my spiritually thirsty soul. You're telling me that. Great. How does that practically work? What am I supposed to do with this? That's where she is, and it's a fair question, but I love how Jesus responds. He says, before I answer the how, let me answer something even more important, the who. Because remember, the goal of a spiritual conversation is to think differently about Jesus when you're done. And that leads to Jesus' profound challenge to her and to all of us. And he says it right out of the gates in verse 10. He says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked and you would have been given. If you knew who, then you'd know how. That's Jesus' challenge. If you're spiritually thirsty this morning, the natural inclination is to say how, but Jesus stops and says, first, I want you to know who. He says, if you only knew who. You know, if you're a good salesman, you realize it's just not, you don't just want to deliver your pitch. You want to deliver your pitch to the person that has the authority to make the decision. These people don't come around anymore, but if a vacuum cleaner salesman somehow knocked on our door, right, and Macy was at the door and let him in, and he came back to his boss, and I said, I met this little 10-year-old kid. I gave her a great pitch. She really loved the vacuum. She was very nice. And then I left. And the manager would say, what did you do that for? You have to find the mom. You've got to sell the pitch to the mom. Selling the pitch to the little 10-year-old doesn't get you anywhere. It's not only like the most important thing is actually, if you're going to make the ask to the right person. So stop and think about that for a second. You are spiritually thirsty. You just are. Whether you're aware of it or not, we're all spiritually thirsty. Who are we asking to quench our thirst? That's Jesus' challenge in this passage, and it's our challenge as well. Who are we asking? Do we ask Jesus for help? Do we go to Him? Do we honestly believe that He can help us? Not just practically, but with the deep spiritual things that we need. See, it's really interesting what Jesus didn't do. He didn't say to her, well, let me teach you a technique. I can actually channel the water up from the ground without even using a bucket. If we just think positive thoughts and make it happen, or whatever it is, or he says, let me design a perfect, bucket and rope and pull it up. No, he says, I want you to first know you've got to come to me. You've got to come to me. If only you knew, he says, you would have asked. The most essential thing about quenching our spiritual thirst is knowing who to ask. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Silver Chair, gives a great story. It's a fictional story about this place called Narnia. And it basically, these little kids show up, and there's this lion called Aslan that represents God. And they're great stories. There are a number of different books. But in one of them, in The Silver Chair, a little girl named Jill is dying of thirst, and she comes to a spring of water, but it's being guarded by this lion, Aslan. And they have this little exchange. Are you not thirsty, said the lion. I'm dying of thirst, said Jill. Then drink, said the lion. May I? Could I? Would you mind going away while I do, said Jill. The lion answered this only by a look and a very low growl. And as Jill gazed at his motionless bulk, she realized that she might as well have asked the whole mountain to move aside for her convenience. This is like awful to read to you guys when it's hot. The delicious rippling noise of the stream was driving her nearly frantic. Will you promise not to do anything to me if I do come, said Jill. I make no promise, said the lion. Jill was so thirsty now that without noticing it, she had come a step nearer. Do you eat girls? She said. I have swallowed up girls and boys, women and men, kings and emperors, cities and realms, said the lion. It didn't say this as if it were boasting, nor as if it were sorry, nor as if it were angry. It just said it. I dare not come and drink, said Jill. Then you will die of thirst, said the lion. Oh dear, said Jill, coming another step nearer. I suppose I must go and look for another stream then. There is no other stream, said the lion. So Jesus makes this offer of living water. He then issues this challenge of saying that you must come to me. I am the one, if only you knew. So the last question we want to look at is, how can he do that? What gives him the right to say that he alone is the source of living water for our spiritual thirst? Jesus wants us to know that he's the one because he is uniquely qualified to do it. If I could, I'm not a bumper sticker guy, but if I could come up with a bumper sticker, I think this is what my bumper sticker would say. Love is the answer, but sin is the problem. Love is the answer, but sin is the problem. And so for someone to really satisfy our spiritual thirst, it would have to be somebody that has the capacity through love to answer the problem that plagues the human soul. And Jesus Christ is saying that I alone am capable of being that one that solves your thirst, because the one who actually is living water became thirsty for us. It's very interesting that on the cross, as he was dying, Jesus could have requested a lot of things, but one of his simple requests was that he was thirsty. He asked, he was thirsty, and his tormentors put vinegar on a sponge and sent it up. Little did they know that it was fulfilling prophecies that were written thousands of years in advance that would describe the death of the Messiah. In Psalm chapter 22, verses 14 to 15, it says that the Messiah says that I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaw. You lay me in the dust of death. In Psalm 69, verse 21, it says, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. These psalms were written thousands of years in advance of the death of Christ on the cross. But what it's basically saying is this, that the one who promises living water to this Samaritan woman would in fact become thirsty for us. He would become thirsty because he alone would be capable of taking the sins of all mankind upon him. And when he took those sins, he offered himself in love to us. Love is the answer, but sin is the problem. And if we're really going to drink from the spiritual water, we need to drink from someone who, in love, could solve the problem of sin. And that's who Jesus is. Jesus engages this woman in a simple spiritual conversation. The goal of the spiritual conversation wasn't to teach techniques or solve all of her practical problems. The goal of the spiritual conversation was to change her image of Jesus, and in changing her image, he provided her traction. And the same is true for us. We have the capacity when we engage in simple spiritual conversations with each other, or when we go out in this community and we have the opportunity to engage others in conversation about Jesus, we can provide spiritual traction by giving them a fuller orbed picture of who Jesus really is. He alone is the one that can satisfy our thirst. He alone is the one that is living water. And when we understand that, we get the sand beneath our wheels. Spiritual traction happens in conversations where our minds are changed about Jesus. Next week, we're going to see the fruit of this conversation. But I'll just give you a little tease. She becomes a more authentic person. And once you become authentic, your wheels are moving. And that's what spiritual traction does. And so we'll get there next week. Thank you for hanging in there this week. I kept thinking, like, gosh, did I have to have a thing about water on a day like today? So thank you for listening. Let me pray for us. Lord, I just thank you that you are living water. You are the source of our spiritual thirst. Thank you that you quench that thirst. Thank you for caring for us. Lord, help us to see you more clearly and help us to provide traction for others as we guide them. We're grateful to you, Jesus. We want to lift you up. We want to think rightly about you. Thank you for this church. Thank you for this chance to be here. In your name, amen. Well, one of our goals is to provide spiritual traction. One of the basic ways we do that is we want to give you an opportunity to pray. Michael and Barb are going to be up here, and they're available to you. If you have any needs that you want prayer, we would love for you to come on up, and it would be their honor to pray with you and for you. But Church One, know this, that you are thirsty, but there is one who is living water that can satisfy your souls, and that is Jesus Christ. May that understanding provide you the spiritual traction you need, and may you take that traction and move into your world and be the sand beneath the wheels of the people that God put you in touch with this week. God bless you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for gutting it out, and we'll see you next week. And again, if you need prayer, come on up and see Mike and Barb. We appreciate you. Thank you so much. Have a great Sunday.